The fog of the North Atlantic wrapped around the frozen waters that March morning in 1943. Waves crashed furiously against the rusted hull of a submarine that many considered obsolete, a relic from bygone times that had no place in this modern war. But what was about to happen in the depths of that merciless ocean would forever change the way the world understood valor, strategy, and the true meaning of heroism. General Bernard Montgomery had spoken those words with disdain just 2 weeks earlier. Standing in the war room in London, surrounded by British and American high command, he had looked at the reports about the Canadian submarine fleet with barely concealed contempt. Cheap, he had called them. Inferior vessels crewed by inexperienced sailors who were playing at being warriors while real men fought the real war. Those words had reached the ears of Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, captain of the HMCS Venturer, one of those supposedly cheap Canadian submarines. He was a man of few words, with steel-gray eyes that had seen more than any 32-year-old should have seen. He didn't respond to Montgomery's insult with anger or indignation. He simply folded the report, placed it in his jacket pocket and returned to his vessel. The Venturer wasn't impressive to look at. Her paint was peeling in places, her engines made sounds that would terrify any engineer, and her instruments were a generation behind what the Americans and British were using in their modern fleets. But Harrison knew something that Montgomery didn't. He knew that wars aren't won by the shiniest equipment or the most expensive technology. Wars are won by men who refuse to quit, by crews who become families, and by captains who understand that every disadvantage can be turned into an advantage if you're smart enough and brave enough. The crew of the Venturer was an unusual collection of souls. There was Tommy MacDonald, the sonar operator from Nova Scotia, who could hear a fish fart at 200 meters. There was Pierre Beaumont, the French-Canadian engineer who could fix anything with duct tape and prayer. There was young Billy Chin, barely 19, whose mathematical mind could calculate torpedo trajectories faster than any mechanical computer. And there were 43 other men, each one carrying their own story, their own fears, their own reasons for being there in the frozen hell of the North Atlantic. They had sailed from Halifax 3 weeks earlier, joining a convoy protection operation that was supposed to be routine. The North Atlantic in 1943 was anything but routine. German U-boats prowled these waters like wolves, hunting the merchant ships that carried the lifeblood of Britain's war effort. Food, fuel, weapons, medicine, everything that kept the island nation alive had to cross this killing ground. And Karl Donitz, the commander of the German submarine fleet, had turned these waters into a graveyard. The strategy was called the Wolfpack. German U-boats would gather in groups, coordinated by radio, and strike convoys in overwhelming numbers. It was devastatingly effective. In the first months of 1943, they were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost and everyone knew it. If something didn't change, Britain would starve and the war would be over. Harrison stood on the bridge of the Venturer as dawn broke over the Atlantic. The convoy stretched out ahead of them, 40 merchant ships arranged in neat columns, escorted by destroyers and corvettes that darted around the formation like sheepdogs. The Venturer's job was to range ahead of the convoy, diving deep to listen for the telltale sounds of U-boats lying in wait. The first contact came at 0630 hours. Tommy MacDonald's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with tension. Sonar contact, bearing 320, range approximately 4,000 meters, multiple signatures at least 6, maybe 8. Harrison felt his stomach tighten. 8 U-boats. It was a full Wolfpack, positioned perfectly to ambush the convoy. The destroyers would engage on the surface, but they'd never get all of them. Some would slip through, and when they did, dozens of merchant ships would die, along with thousands of men. He made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it failed. Instead of reporting the contact and waiting for orders, instead of falling back to protect the convoy, he ordered the Venturer to dive and attack. Alone. 1 Canadian submarine against 8 German U-boats. His executive officer, a young lieutenant named Robert Chin, Billy's older brother, looked at him with wide eyes. "Sir, shouldn't we call this in? Request support?" Harrison shook his head. "By the time support arrives, they'll have scattered or repositioned. We have them now and they don't know we're here. That's our advantage. That's our only advantage." The Venturer dove, her old hull creaking and groaning as the pressure increased. 100 feet. 200 feet. 300 feet. At 400 feet they leveled off, running silent. Every unnecessary system was shut down. The crew moved in stockings, communicating in whispers. The only sounds were the hum of the electric motors and the ping of the sonar. Tommy MacDonald worked his equipment with the concentration of a surgeon. He could hear them now, all 8 U-boats, their diesel engines idling as they waited in ambush formation. They were spread out in a picket line, covering a front of about 6 miles. It was a textbook Wolfpack deployment, and it would have been devastatingly effective against the convoy. But they weren't expecting another submarine. Submarine warfare in 1943 was almost entirely a one-sided affair. Submarines hunted surface ships. Submarines didn't hunt other submarines. The technology wasn't there, the tactics hadn't been developed, and frankly, it seemed almost impossible. A submerged submarine attacking another submerged submarine was like two blind men trying to fight in a dark room. But Harrison had been thinking about this problem for 2 years. He had studied every report, every encounter, every piece of intelligence about German U-boat tactics. He had run drills with his crew until they could operate in their sleep. And he had developed something that nobody else had, a doctrine for submarine versus submarine combat. The key was patience and silence, and understanding that sound travels in strange ways underwater, bending and reflecting off temperature layers and density gradients. Tommy McDonald didn't just listen to the U-boats. He listened to the ocean itself, mapping the invisible architecture of the water, finding the channels and corridors where sound traveled. Target designated Alpha, Harrison whispered. It was the closest U-boat, about 3,500 meters away, positioned at the northern end of the picket line. Range, bearing, and depth were fed into Billy Chen's calculations. The young mathematician worked his slide rule and charts, his lips moving silently as he ran through the equations. His hands were steady despite his age, despite the knowledge that 8 enemy submarines surrounded them, any one of which could send them to the bottom if they were detected. Torpedo solution ready, Billy reported. Recommend firing spread of 2, offset by 5 degrees. Harrison nodded. The Venturer carried only 12 torpedoes. In a normal engagement against surface ships, they might fire a spread of 4 or 6 to ensure at least one hit. But they weren't in a normal engagement. If they were going to take on 8 U-boats, they needed to make every torpedo count. He gave the order. Fire 1. 5 seconds later. Fire 2. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air pushed the torpedoes out of their tubes. Then silence. 43 men held their breath as the torpedoes ran hot and true through the black water. 35 seconds. 40 seconds. 50 seconds. The first explosion was muffled but unmistakable, a deep boom that resonated through the water like thunder. The second explosion followed 3 seconds later. Tommy McDonald's sonar screen showed the death throes of the U-boat designated Alpha, the sounds of bulkheads collapsing and air escaping and metal tearing as the submarine broke apart and sank. 1 down. 7 to go. But now the other U-boats knew something was wrong. Harrison could imagine the chaos on those German vessels, the confusion and fear. They knew one of their pack had been hit, but they didn't know by what. Surface ships? Aircraft? Another submarine? Impossible. The German commander made his first mistake. Instead of scattering immediately, he ordered his boats to converge on the last known position of Alpha, searching for survivors, trying to understand what had happened. It was a humane impulse, a leader's instinct to protect his men. But it was also a tactical error that would cost him dearly. Harrison ordered the Venturer deeper and to the east, slipping below a temperature layer that would mask their sound signature. They moved slowly, barely making way, while Tommy McDonald tracked the Germans as they clustered together. It was like watching sheep gather after a wolf strike, bunching up for protection without realizing that it just made them a better target. Target Bravo, Harrison designated the second U-boat. This one was slightly smaller than the first, probably a Type 7, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet. Billy Chin ran his calculations again, adjusting for the current and the target's slow movement. This time Harrison fired a spread of 3 torpedoes, knowing that the Germans were now alert and might try evasive maneuvers once they heard the torpedoes coming. It was a gamble, using 3 of their precious torpedoes on a single target, but he trusted his gut. The wait was agony. 60 seconds. 70 seconds. At 85 seconds, the first torpedo exploded. Harrison heard the second torpedo pass close and explode against the seafloor beyond the target. The third wasn't needed. Bravo was already dying, her hull ruptured, her crew's screams traveling through the water in a horrible acoustic signature that Tommy McDonald would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. 2 down. 6 to go. Now the Germans reacted. The Wolfpack scattered, each U-boat diving and running in a different direction, their commanders finally understanding that they were the ones being hunted. It was a complete reversal of everything they knew about submarine warfare, and the psychological impact was devastating. But scattering was exactly what Harrison wanted them to do. A coordinated Wolfpack was dangerous. 8 individual submarines, confused and afraid, were manageable. He ordered the Venturer to come shallow to periscope depth, taking a calculated risk to get better situational awareness. Through the periscope, Harrison saw a sight he would never forget. The ocean surface was alive with debris from the 2 sunken U-boats, oil slicks spreading like blood in the water, bits of wreckage and personal effects, and the occasional flash of a life vest. And in the distance, the convoy steamed on, unaware of the battle being fought in the depths beneath them. Target Charlie, he designated, tracking a U-boat that was running northeast, probably trying to escape to deeper water where they could hide. But the Venturer was faster when running submerged on electric motors, and Harrison had the angle on them. He ordered flank speed, a dangerous move that made noise but closed the distance rapidly. Billy Chin worked his plots. Pierre Beaumont coaxed every ounce of speed from the electric motors, watching the battery gauges drop alarmingly. They had maybe 40 minutes of battery life left at this speed, maybe an hour if they slowed down. After that, they'd have to surface to run the diesels and recharge, and if any of the remaining U-boats were nearby when that happened, they'd be sitting ducks. Fire 1, Fire 2, Harrison ordered. 2 torpedoes to conserve their dwindling supply. He didn't have time for a third shot. The U-boat designated Charlie had increased speed and was zigzagging, their captain smart enough to make himself a harder target. 1 torpedo missed, its wake passing ahead of the target. But the second torpedo, guided by Billy Chen's mathematical genius and Tommy McDonald's acoustic tracking, struck Charlie amidships. The explosion was catastrophic. The U-boat must have been carrying a full load of torpedoes because the secondary explosions went on for almost a minute, a rolling series of blasts that lit up the sonar screen like fireworks. 3 down. 5 to go. But the Venturer was in trouble. The battery charge was down to 30%. They had 6 torpedoes left. And the remaining 5 U-boats, after the initial panic, were regrouping. Worse, Harrison realized that at least one of those U-boats had a smart commander who had figured out what was happening. Instead of running, this U-boat was hunting them in return. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse, or rather cat and cat, 2 submarines circling each other in the black depths, each trying to get a firing solution on the other without being detected first. Tommy McDonald reported multiple sonar contacts, impossible to differentiate, the sound signatures blending and reflecting off the thermoclines and the ocean floor. Then silence. Complete silence. All 5 remaining U-boats had stopped their engines and were drifting, listening, waiting. It was a standard German tactic and it was effective. Without engine noise, the U-boats were nearly impossible to detect. Harrison made a decision that terrified his crew. He ordered the Venturer's motors shut down as well. Now they were drifting too, in complete silence in the pitch-black deep, surrounded by 5 enemy submarines that wanted to kill them. The only sounds were the creaking of the hull and the breathing of 43 men trying to be as quiet as possible. Minutes passed like hours. Tommy McDonald strained at his sonar set, listening for the slightest sound, any indication of where the enemy was. Harrison stood frozen at the periscope, his hand on the firing solution calculator, ready to order an attack the instant they had a target. Then Tommy heard it. A whisper of sound so faint it was almost subliminal. Machinery, maybe a bilge pump or a hydraulic system, coming from bearing 275, range estimated at 1,500 meters. Target Delta. Harrison had to make an impossible choice. If they started their motors to maneuver for a better firing angle, the Germans would hear them instantly. But if they fired from their current position, the shot would be nearly impossible, threading the needle through narrow acoustic channels, hoping the torpedo would find its target. He looked at Billy Chin. The young mathematician was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. But his hands were steady as he worked the calculations, factoring in drift, current, the target's probable movement, a dozen variables that had to be exactly right or the torpedo would miss and give away their position. Solution ready, Billy whispered. Probability of hit, approximately 35%. 35%. It was terrible odds. But Harrison knew that if they didn't take this shot, if they let this opportunity pass, they might not get another one. The batteries were dying. Dawn was coming and with it the possibility of German aircraft. They were out of time and out of options. Fire 1, he ordered. The torpedo launched with a soft whoosh of compressed air. For 15 seconds nothing happened. Then chaos erupted. The Germans heard the torpedo and panicked. 4 of the 5 U-boats started their engines simultaneously, diving and turning trying to evade. But target Delta, the one Harrison had fired at, was too slow to react. The torpedo struck home and another German submarine died. 4 down. 4 to go. But now the Venturer was completely exposed. 4 angry, frightened U-boats knew their approximate position, and they were closing in. Harrison ordered the motors started, battery charge be damned, and dove the Venturer toward the ocean floor, pushing her down to 500 feet, deeper than she was rated for. The hull groaned in protest, rivets popping, cold water spraying from a dozen small leaks. One of the German U-boats got a firing solution. Tommy McDonald heard the torpedoes launch, 2 of them running fast and hot toward the Venturer. Harrison ordered hard to starboard, down angle 20 degrees, trying to dive under the torpedo's running depth. The Venturer responded sluggishly, her batteries nearly exhausted, her old motors struggling. The first torpedo passed overhead so close that the crew could hear its propeller through the hull. The second torpedo passed below them by what couldn't have been more than 10 meters. If Harrison had held his previous course for another 2 seconds, they would have died. But the German commander had made a mistake. By firing, he had given away his exact position. Harrison, despite the fact that his submarine was nearly dead in the water, despite the fact that they had only 4 torpedoes left, ordered a return shot. Billy Chin worked his calculations with shaking hands. Pierre Beaumont somehow coaxed a few more revolutions from the dying motors. Fire 1, fire 2, Harrison ordered, firing their second-to-last pair of torpedoes. Both torpedoes ran true. Both hit the target. Target Echo, the U-boat that had nearly killed them, exploded with such violence that the shockwave rocked the Venturer, throwing men to the deck, shattering gauge glass in the control room. 5 down. 3 to go. But the Venturer was finished. The batteries were at 4%. The hull had dozens of leaks. They had 2 torpedoes left. And 3 German U-boats were still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. Harrison ordered the submarine to surface. It was a desperate move, but they had no choice. They needed to run the diesels to recharge the batteries, and they needed to make repairs before the hull failed completely. As the Venturer rose toward the surface, every man aboard knew they were vulnerable, knew that if any of the 3 remaining U-boats were close, they'd be torpedoed before they could dive again. The submarine broke the surface in the gray dawn light. The sea was rough, waves crashing over the deck. Harrison climbed up to the bridge with a damage control party, and they went to work immediately, welding patches, plugging leaks, anything to keep the old boat together for a few more hours. The diesels roared to life and the batteries began to slowly recharge. 10%, 15%, 20%. Harrison knew they needed at least 40% to have any chance of diving and maneuvering effectively. That meant at least another hour on the surface. That's when Tommy McDonald's voice crackled over the radio. Contact. Multiple contacts. 3 U-boats surfacing, bearing 090, range 8,000 meters. Harrison grabbed his binoculars and looked east. There they were, 3 German submarines surfacing simultaneously about 4 miles away. They had heard the Venturer's diesels and made the same calculation Harrison had. In a surface engagement, 4 miles was close range. The U-boats had deck guns and so did the Venturer, though hers was old and hadn't been fired in months. What happened next was something that hadn't been seen since World War I. 4 submarines on the surface in broad daylight, preparing for a gun battle in the middle of the North Atlantic. It was anachronistic, insane, but it was about to happen. Harrison ordered the gun crew to their stations. 6 men scrambled out onto the deck, fighting the waves, making their way to the forward deck gun. The gun captain was a grizzled veteran named McPherson who claimed he had fought in the previous war. Now, at 52 years old, he was about to fight in this one again. The Germans fired first. 3 muzzle flashes, and then 3 waterspouts erupted around the Venturer, close enough that everyone on deck was drenched with spray. McPherson calmly trained his gun, adjusted for range and wind, and fired back. The Canadian shell fell short by 200 meters. The battle became a slugging match. The Germans had 3 guns to the Venturer's 1, but McPherson's crew was well trained and determined. They loaded and fired, while German shells walked closer and closer to their target. 1 shell hit the water so close to the Venturer that the explosion buckled plates in the hull. Another shell hit the deck gun's shield, a glancing blow that sent shrapnel flying and wounded 2 of McPherson's crew. But McPherson himself was untouched and he kept firing. His 3rd shot hit one of the German U-boats, striking the conning tower and killing the officers on the bridge. The U-boat immediately began to list, her crew scrambling to get below before she sank. McPherson's 4th shot missed, but his 5th shot hit the same U-boat again, this time below the waterline. She went down fast, her stern rising out of the water as her bow sank, the propellers still spinning futilely in the air. 6 down. 2 to go. The 2 remaining German U-boats decided they'd had enough. They began to submerge, diving to escape the surprisingly effective Canadian gunnery. Harrison saw his opportunity. The batteries were at 38%, not ideal but enough. He ordered the Venturer to dive as well, ordering the gun crew below, securing the hatches, taking the submarine down. Now it was a race. Who could submerge faster, get to depth and get a firing solution first? The Venturer was older, but her crew had practiced crash dives 1,000 times. They went down fast, leveling off at 300 feet, sonar searching for the two German submarines. Tommy MacDonald found them. Both were diving steeply, heading for deep water, trying to put distance between themselves and the crazy Canadian submarine that had already destroyed 6 of their packmates. Harrison picked the closest one, designated it as Target Foxtrot and ordered the attack. They had 2 torpedoes left. 2 chances. If both missed, they'd be defenseless. Harrison couldn't afford to miss. Billy Chin worked his calculations one more time, his exhausted mind still sharp, still precise. The solution was ready. The angle was good. The range was optimal. Fire 1, Harrison ordered. He held the second torpedo in reserve, waiting to see if the first one would hit. The torpedo ran for 47 seconds. Then it struck Target Foxtrot amidships, breaking the U-boat's back. She sank quickly, taking all hands with her. 7 down. 1 to go. The last German U-boat, Target Golf, didn't try to fight. Her commander, having watched 7 of his comrades die in less than 4 hours, made the only rational decision. He ran. Full speed, running deep, heading northeast toward the Greenland coast where he might find sanctuary or at least deep enough water to hide. But Harrison wasn't going to let him go. Not after everything they'd been through. Not after the men they'd lost and the risks they'd taken. He ordered the Venturer to pursue, pushing the old submarine to her limits one more time. The batteries were draining again. The crew was exhausted. But they chased. For 3 hours they chased Target Golf across the North Atlantic. The German commander was skilled, using every trick he knew. He ran through temperature layers to mask his sound signature. He changed course and speed randomly. He dove deep and then shallow. But Tommy MacDonald stayed on him, never losing the faint acoustic signature of the fleeing U-boat. Finally, Target Golf made a mistake. Whether from exhaustion or panic, the German commander brought his submarine too shallow too quickly, and the British destroyer that had been searching for survivors from the convoy battle detected him on radar. The destroyer attacked with depth charges, and Target Golf was forced to dive again, right into the range where the Venturer was waiting. Harrison didn't hesitate. Fire 2, he ordered, launching their last torpedo. It was a long shot, over 3,000 meters, with the target maneuvering evasively. Billy Chin had done the best he could with the calculations, but so much depended on luck now. The torpedo ran for 1 minute and 15 seconds. Then it struck Target Golf in the stern, destroying her propellers and rudder. The German submarine lost all propulsion and began to slowly sink, unable to control her depth. Harrison brought the Venturer up to periscope depth and watched as Target Golf's crew evacuated, the submarine settling lower and lower in the water until she finally slipped beneath the surface for the last time. 8 down. 8 German U-boats destroyed in a single engagement by one supposedly cheap, obsolete Canadian submarine. Harrison ordered the Venturer to surface. They picked up 37 German survivors from Target Golf, including her commander, a Captain Lieutenant named Friedrich Weber, who looked at Harrison with something like awe when he came aboard. In broken English, Weber said, "We thought we were hunting a convoy. We never thought a submarine would hunt us. How did you do it?" Harrison just smiled, exhausted, and said, "We did what we had to do." The Venturer limped back to Halifax, her batteries nearly dead, her hull leaking in a dozen places, her crew exhausted but victorious. When they arrived, word of their engagement had already spread. 8 German U-boats sunk in one battle. It was unprecedented. It was impossible. But it had happened. The news reached London, and eventually it reached General Montgomery. There are no records of what he said when he heard the news, but according to legend, he crumpled up the report and threw it in the trash without comment. He never publicly acknowledged his mistake. He never apologized for calling the Canadian submarines cheap. But he never made that mistake again either. After the Venturer's engagement, Canadian submarines were given more respect, better support, and recognition as a serious fighting force. The Royal Canadian Navy submarine service expanded, and many of the tactics Harrison had developed were adopted by Allied submarine forces across the Atlantic. The Battle of the North Atlantic continued for another 2 years, but the tide had turned. The Germans never again attempted to mass their U-boats in large wolfpacks in that sector. The psychological impact of 8 U-boats being destroyed by a single Allied submarine was devastating to German morale and forced a complete rethinking of their submarine warfare doctrine. Harrison was promoted to commander and awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. Tommy MacDonald received the Distinguished Service Medal. Billy Chin was commissioned as an officer and eventually became one of the Navy's top tacticians. Pierre Beaumont was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and continued to keep impossibly broken machinery running for the rest of the war. The Venturer herself survived the war, though just barely. She was decommissioned in 1945, her old hull finally too worn out to continue. But before she was scrapped, her crew gathered one more time on her deck in Halifax Harbor. 43 men who had been through hell together, who had done the impossible together. Harrison stood on the bridge one last time and looked at his crew. He thought about Montgomery's words, about how this cheap submarine and her inexperienced crew had been written off as irrelevant to the real war. He thought about the 8 German U-boats resting on the bottom of the Atlantic, and the thousands of Allied sailors in the convoy they had saved, sailors who would never know how close they came to death that day in March 1943. "This is what people don't understand about war," Harrison said to his executive officer, Robert Chin, who had survived the entire ordeal and become one of his closest friends. "They think it's about who has the newest equipment or the biggest budget or the most impressive technology. But it's not. It's about people. It's about crews who trust each other. It's about leaders who refuse to quit. It's about doing the impossible because the alternative is unthinkable." Robert Chin nodded, looking at the old submarine that had been their home and their fortress. "She was cheap, wasn't she?" he said with a smile. "Old, obsolete, not worthy of respect." Harrison smiled back. "She was perfect," he said. "She was exactly what we needed." The story of the Venturer and her crew became legend in naval warfare history. Military academies study the battle to this day, analyzing Harrison's tactics and decision-making. The engagement is considered one of the most significant submarine battles of World War II, not because of the number of ships sunk, but because it proved that submarines could effectively hunt other submarines, opening up an entirely new dimension of undersea warfare. But more than the tactical innovations, more than the strategic implications, the story of the Venturer represents something deeper about human courage and determination. It's a story about being underestimated and proving everyone wrong. It's a story about a group of ordinary men who did extraordinary things because they refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. Montgomery never acknowledged his error publicly, but history has rendered its verdict. The cheap Canadian submarine and her inexperienced crew achieved something that his expensive, modern forces could not. They turned the tide in one of the most crucial battles of the war. They saved thousands of lives. They changed the course of history. In the decades after the war, historians discovered German naval records that provided more details about that March day in 1943. The 8 U-boats that encountered the Venturer were some of Germany's most experienced crews, veterans of dozens of successful attacks on Allied shipping. Their commanders were skilled officers with years of combat experience. And yet, they were completely outfought by a single Canadian submarine that many had dismissed as obsolete. The German records show the confusion and fear that gripped the Wolfpack as, one by one, their comrades were destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't defeat. One German survivor, interviewed in the 1970s, described the experience as like being hunted by a ghost. "We could hear the explosions," he said, his eyes distant with memory. "We could hear our brothers dying. But we couldn't find the enemy. We didn't know where he was. We didn't know how he was doing it. We just knew that we were being destroyed one by one and there was nothing we could do to stop it." That ghost was the Venturer, crewed by men like Tommy MacDonald, who could hear what others couldn't hear. Men like Billy Chin, who could calculate what others couldn't calculate. Men like Pierre Beaumont, who could fix what others said was unfixable. And led by a man like James Harrison, who refused to be limited by what others said was possible. The Venturer's final resting place is a matter of some debate. Official records say she was scrapped in 1947, her metal recycled for peacetime use. But some of her crew members claimed that parts of her were preserved, that her conning tower and control room were saved and placed in a museum somewhere in Canada. Whether that's true or not, the spirit of the Venturer lives on in every submarine service in the world. The tactics Harrison developed, the doctrine he proved possible, the courage he demonstrated, these things didn't die when the submarine was decommissioned. They became part of the DNA of modern naval warfare. Today, submarines routinely hunt other submarines. Advanced sonar systems, guided torpedoes, and sophisticated tactics make it possible in ways Harrison could never have imagined. But the fundamental principles remain the same: patience, silence, courage, and the understanding that the side that thinks more clearly, acts more decisively, and refuses to quit has the advantage, regardless of whose equipment is newer or more expensive. The story of the Venturer is a reminder that wars are not won by machines but by the men and women who operate them. Technology is important, resources matter, but at the end of the day victory goes to those who want it more, who think more creatively, and who refuse to accept defeat. Montgomery's insult became the Venturer's badge of honor. Cheap, he had called them. The crew embraced it. They painted the word cheap on the side of the conning tower, turning the general's mockery into a defiant declaration. We might be cheap, they seemed to say, but we're also effective. We might not be pretty, but we get the job done. We might not impress you in port, but in battle we're deadly. That attitude, that refusal to be defined by others' expectations, that determination to prove their worth through actions rather than appearances, that's what made the difference. That's what turned a supposedly obsolete submarine into a ship of legend. Harrison lived until 1987, passing away at the age of 76. In his later years he rarely spoke about the war, preferring to focus on his work as a teacher and mentor to young officers in the Canadian Navy. But on the 40th anniversary of the battle, he gave one interview to a naval history magazine. The reporter asked him what he thought about when he looked back on that day in March 1943. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his steel-gray eyes looking at something far away. Then he said, "I think about the men. My men who trusted me enough to follow me into what looked like certain death. And the German men who were just doing their duty, who died in those cold waters far from home. War makes enemies of men who might have been friends in another time. I'm proud of what we accomplished, but I'm not proud of the killing. I'm just grateful we survived to see peace." That humility, that recognition of the humanity of the enemy, that's another reason why Harrison was such an effective leader. He never lost sight of the fact that wars are fought between human beings, not machines or nations or ideologies. The men in those German U-boats were fathers and sons and brothers, just like his own crew. Defeating them was necessary, but it wasn't something to celebrate thoughtlessly. The convoy that the Venturer saved that day reached Britain safely. 40 merchant ships delivered their cargo of food, fuel, and supplies. Because those ships arrived, factories kept running. Soldiers had ammunition. Civilians had food. The war effort continued. It's impossible to calculate how many lives the Venturer saved, both directly and indirectly. The merchant sailors on those 40 ships. The soldiers who fought with the ammunition those ships carried. The civilians who ate the food and stayed alive to work in the factories and farms. The children who weren't orphaned because their fathers came home from the war. One act of courage, one decision to attack instead of retreat, one obsolete submarine crewed by supposedly inexperienced men, changed all of that. It's a butterfly effect that rippled through history in ways large and small, touching lives that never knew the Venturer existed. There's a memorial in Halifax where the Venturer sailed from. It's a simple stone marker with the submarine's name and the dates of her service. There are no grand statues or elaborate monuments. Just a marker that says she was there, she served, she mattered. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, a few old men gather at that memorial. Their numbers dwindle each year as time claims what the war did not. They stand in silence for a moment, remembering friends who didn't come home, remembering the fear and the courage and the strange brotherhood that forms between men who face death together. And sometimes, if you're there on the right day, you might hear one of them tell a story. About the time their cheap, obsolete submarine took on 8 German U-boats and won. About the time they proved that courage and skill matter more than money and technology. About the time they did the impossible because someone told them they couldn't. That's the real story of the Venturer. Not just the tactics in the battle and the number of enemy ships sunk, but the human story. The story of men who were underestimated and used that underestimation as a weapon. The story of a leader who trusted his crew and a crew that trusted their leader. The story of doing what needed to be done, even when everyone said it was impossible. That ghost was crewed by men who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. Men who understood that being underestimated was an advantage, not a weakness. Men who knew that the cheapest submarine with the best crew would always defeat the most expensive submarine with a mediocre crew. The lesson of the Venturer echoes through time, relevant not just to naval warfare but to every aspect of human endeavor. It teaches us that what others think of us matters far less than what we think of ourselves. That determination and skill can overcome superior resources. That innovation comes from necessity, and greatness often emerges from adversity. Harrison's final words, spoken to a young naval officer who asked him the secret of his success, were simple and profound. "There is no secret," he said. "You take care of your people, you trust them to do their jobs, you make the best decisions you can with the information you have, and you never, ever quit. The moment you accept defeat, you're defeated. But as long as you keep fighting, keep thinking, keep trying, you always have a chance." The venture proved that. One cheap submarine. 43 men. 8 enemy submarines destroyed. Thousands of lives saved. History changed. When the last survivor of the Venture's crew passed away in 2009, a small ceremony was held at the memorial in Halifax. Naval officers from Canada, Britain, and even Germany attended, paying respects to men who had shown extraordinary courage in extraordinary circumstances. A German naval attaché laid a wreath and spoke briefly about how the engagement had been studied at German naval academies for decades as an example of tactical brilliance and the importance of never underestimating an opponent. The cheap Canadian submarine had earned respect that outlasted nations and ideologies, respect that transcended the boundaries of former enemies. Because true courage, true skill, true determination, these things command respect from anyone capable of recognizing them. Today, somewhere in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, 8 German U-boats rest on the ocean floor, monuments to the men who served in them and the day they encountered something they never expected. And somewhere, in the memories of those who know the story, the Venturer still prowls those depths, proving that being cheap doesn't mean being inferior, that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. Montgomery mocked the cheap Canadian submarine. History proved him catastrophically wrong. The Venturer and her crew didn't just sink 8 U-boats. They sank the idea that money and appearances matter more than courage and skill. They proved that the human spirit, properly led and properly motivated, can overcome any technological disadvantage. They showed the world that sometimes the cheapest option is the most valuable one, because it's crewed by people who have something to prove. That's the legacy of the Venturer. That's the story that needs to be remembered. Not just as a footnote in naval history, but as a testament to what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to be limited by others' expectations, when they trust each other completely, and when they do what needs to be done regardless of the cost. The cheap submarine won. The expensive submarines are forgotten. And that tells you everything you need to know about what really matters in war, in life, and in the human story.